July 12, 1970. The mountains of Thua Thien Province, South Vietnam. Morning mist crawled through the valleys like phosphorus smoke, clinging to emerald ridges that rose from the jungle floor like ancient monuments. The air hung thick with humidity and the metallic scent of approaching rain. On a barren hilltop 700 meters above sea level, Fire Support Base Ripcord perched like a concrete crown on the skull of the earth. The rhythmic thrum of UH-1 Huey helicopters echoed across the valleys, their turbine engines whining against the weight of ammunition pallets and wounded souls. Inside the perimeter, the smell of diesel fuel mixed with cordite and the unmistakable odor of men who had not bathed in weeks. Sergeant First Class Michael Dorsey knelt beside his M60 machine gun, cleaning the feed cover with movements that had become ritual, each motion deliberate, each inspection sacred. He understood what career officers back at headquarters did not. In Vietnam, silence before battle carried more menace than the chaos that followed. The 101st Airborne Division had established Ripcord as part of Operation Texas Star, a sweeping campaign designed to interdict North Vietnamese supply lines flowing through the A Shau Valley. Military planners in Saigon viewed these mountain bases as chess pieces, strategic positions that could dominate terrain and deny sanctuary to enemy forces. But chess assumes rational opponents who respect conventional rules. The North Vietnamese army had spent 4 years learning that American firepower was formidable, but American patience was finite. Ripcord represented everything ambitious and flawed about American military doctrine in Southeast Asia. The base occupied the highest defensible ground for miles, offering commanding fields of fire and helicopter landing zones. Its circular design maximized defensive coverage while concentrating support facilities. 6 105mm howitzers provided artillery support for infantry operations throughout the valley. Claymore anti-personnel mines ringed the perimeter in overlapping fields of destruction. Triple concertina wire created barriers that should have been impassable. Weeks before the siege that would define Ripcord's legacy, officers at Camp Evans briefed their subordinates with confidence that bordered on arrogance. Intelligence reports suggested minimal enemy activity in the immediate area. Regional commanders assured field units that North Vietnamese forces lacked the logistical capability to sustain major operations in such remote terrain. The prevailing wisdom held that enemy forces would avoid costly frontal assaults against fortified positions defended by American firepower. These assessments reflected a fundamental misunderstanding of their opponent. While American commanders studied topographical maps and calculated fields of fire, North Vietnamese engineers were tunneling through solid rock. While American intelligence officers debated troop movements, NVA sappers were positioning 82mm mortars on reverse slopes beyond the reach of counter-battery fire. While American planners assumed rational cost-benefit analysis would deter attack, their enemies were preparing to demonstrate that conviction could overcome mathematics. The geography that American forces viewed as protective isolation became, in enemy hands, a trap. Ripcord's elevation provided excellent observation and fields of fire, but also made the base visible from multiple directions. The steep terrain that seemed to offer natural protection actually channeled attack routes and created dead spaces where infantry could approach undetected. Most critically, the base's remote location meant that reinforcement and resupply depended entirely on helicopter operations that became increasingly vulnerable as enemy forces positioned anti-aircraft weapons on surrounding ridgelines. 400 men of the 101st Airborne defended Ripcord. They came from small towns across America, carrying names like Johnson and Martinez, O'Brien and Washington. Most were barely old enough to vote, yet they operated weapons systems that required precision and judgment beyond their years. The M60 machine gun demanded not just physical strength, but mechanical understanding, knowledge of headspace and timing, of barrel changes and ammunition types, of the subtle differences between suppressive fire and precision engagement. Every aspect of life at Ripcord depended on helicopters. UH-1 Hueys delivered mail, ammunition, water, and fresh troops. They evacuated wounded soldiers and transported commanders to briefings. CH-47 Chinook helicopters lifted artillery pieces and construction materials. When weather permitted, smaller OH-6 Cayuse aircraft provided reconnaissance and target designation. This aerial umbilical cord represented both lifeline and vulnerability. Each helicopter approaching Ripcord carried supplies essential for survival and presented a target that enemy forces were increasingly prepared to engage. The monsoon season of 1970 brought weather that challenged both defensive preparations and helicopter operations. Morning fog obscured vision beyond 20 meters. Afternoon thunderstorms turned helicopter landing zones into mud pits and reduced visibility to near zero. Rain seeped through sandbags, corrupted ammunition, and created conditions where electronic equipment failed regularly. The red clay soil of the hilltop became slippery clay when wet, complicating movement and making defensive positions treacherous. Temperature variations added another layer of complexity. Dawn brought mountain cold that made metal weapons painful to touch. Midday sun heated that same metal until it could burn flesh. These extremes affected not just human comfort, but equipment reliability. M60 machine guns required different maintenance procedures in wet conditions versus dry heat. Radio batteries drained faster in cold weather. Helicopter engines struggled in thin mountain air combined with high humidity. July approached with ominous signs that intelligence officers either missed or misinterpreted. Patrol activity around Ripcord encountered increasingly sophisticated booby traps. Radio intercepts suggested growing enemy interest in American positions throughout the Aishau Valley. Most telling, helicopter crews reported ground fire from locations that had previously been clear. These indicators suggested not random harassment, but coordinated preparation. The first definitive proof of enemy intentions came through the most ancient of military intelligence methods: observation. Soldiers manning perimeter positions began reporting movement on distant ridgelines. Movement too organized to be coincidental, too persistent to be accidental. Binoculars revealed glimpses of uniformed figures positioning equipment on slopes that provided observation into American positions. The enemy was not merely present, they were preparing. What American defenders could not see was the scale of preparation occurring beyond their visual range. North Vietnamese forces had spent weeks moving supplies along trail networks invisible from Ripcord. Mortar positions were dug into reverse slopes that provided protection from American artillery, while offering indirect fire capability against the base. Anti-aircraft positions were established at multiple locations to create overlapping fields of fire against helicopter approaches. Most ominously, infantry assault positions were prepared at points where terrain features provided concealment during final approach. This preparation reflected North Vietnamese understanding of American tactical doctrine and psychological tendencies. They knew that Ripcord's defenders expected attacks to begin with probing actions that would escalate gradually. They understood that American forces relied heavily on artillery and air support to break up enemy formations before they could close to effective range. They recognized that helicopter-dependent outposts became increasingly vulnerable once landing zones came under effective fire. The North Vietnamese plan for Ripcord demonstrated tactical sophistication that American commanders consistently underestimated. Rather than launching human wave attacks against prepared positions, enemy forces would use coordinated indirect fire to suppress American weapons while infantry moved through predetermined approach routes. Anti-aircraft fire would complicate helicopter operations, gradually strangling the base's supply lines. The objective was not necessarily to overrun Ripcord through direct assault, but to make its continued operation unsustainable. July 1st, 1970. Dawn arrived gray and humid, with low clouds that seemed to press down on the hilltop like a steel blanket. Morning routine proceeded normally. Soldiers cleaned weapons, inspected equipment, and consumed breakfast rations that tasted like cardboard mixed with salt. Radio operators established communications with higher headquarters and helicopter units. Artillery crews verified firing data for defensive concentrations. Everything appeared routine. The illusion of normalcy shattered at 0547 hours. The first mortar rounds fell with the distinctive whistle thump that every infantryman learned to recognize and fear. 82mm high explosive shells impacted inside the perimeter with devastating accuracy. Communications bunkers, ammunition storage areas, and helicopter landing zones received concentrated fire that spoke of careful observation and precise targeting. The base's radio antennas disintegrated in showers of sparks and twisted metal. Sergeant Dorsey's M60 position took a near miss that showered his fighting hole with red dirt and metal fragments. The concussion left his ears ringing and his vision blurred, but training took over where conscious thought failed. Hands moved automatically to check his weapon for damage while eyes scanned sectors of responsibility for targets. The machine gun appeared functional, but ammunition belts were scattered and partially buried. Counter-battery fire from American 105mm howitzers began within minutes, but return fire proved largely ineffective. Enemy mortar positions were carefully concealed and positioned on reverse slopes that provided natural protection. American artillery observers struggled to identify target locations through smoke and debris. Radio communications were degraded by damaged equipment and enemy jamming efforts. The mortar barrage continued for 23 minutes. Each explosion inside the perimeter caused casualties and equipment damage that accumulated into tactical crisis. Medical personnel struggled to treat wounded soldiers while remaining under fire. Ammunition storage areas burned, sending secondary explosions across the base that added chaos to confusion. Most critically, the helicopter landing zones became impassable due to cratering and unexploded ordnance. When the mortars finally fell silent, defenders expected infantry assault to begin immediately. Standard North Vietnamese tactics called for indirect fire to suppress defenders, while assault forces moved to jump-off positions. American soldiers manned fighting positions and prepared to engage enemy infantry advancing up the slopes toward their perimeter. Machine gunners like Dorsey checked ammunition supplies and verified fields of fire. The assault did not come. Instead, a different kind of warfare began. Sniper fire from concealed positions on surrounding ridgelines made movement within the base dangerous. Soldiers crossing between fighting positions drew accurate fire that indicated careful observation and range determination. Medical evacuation became impossible, as helicopter landing zones remained under enemy observation and fire. The base was effectively isolated. This tactical approach demonstrated North Vietnamese understanding of American psychology and logistics.
Rather than accepting heavy casualties in direct assault, enemy forces chose to strangle Ripcord gradually. Each day that helicopters could not land meant less ammunition, water, and medical supplies. Each casualty that could not be evacuated reduced American morale while stretching medical resources. Each damaged radio or weapon system that could not be repaired decreased defensive capability. The siege of Ripcord had begun, though few at the base understood the full implications.
Military doctrine prepared American forces for decisive battle with clear outcomes. The prolonged isolation and gradual degradation of capability that North Vietnamese forces imposed represented warfare at its most psychological, a test of endurance rather than firepower, of will rather than technology. July the 2nd brought the first serious attempt to resupply the base by helicopter. UH-1 Hueys approached from multiple directions, hoping to confuse enemy gunners and reduce effective fire. The first aircraft to attempt landing drew accurate small arms fire that forced immediate abort. The second helicopter managed to hover over the landing zone long enough to push out several ammunition pallets before taking hits in the tail rotor and engine compartment. Chief Warrant Officer David Martinez fought his damaged Huey through auto-rotation landing that left the aircraft intact but non-flyable. His crew became additional defenders rather than support personnel, adding rifles to the perimeter but consuming supplies that were not being replaced. The helicopter itself became another casualty, requiring evacuation that would strain future missions. The pattern was established. Each resupply attempt faced increasingly sophisticated enemy fire. North Vietnamese forces had observed American helicopter operations for weeks before beginning their siege, documenting approach routes, landing procedures, and aircraft vulnerability. Anti-aircraft positions were positioned to create interlocking fields of fire that made any landing zone dangerous, while remaining concealed from American ground observation. Artillery support from distant fire bases provided some relief, but was limited by ammunition supply and weather conditions. Radio communications with supporting units were intermittent due to equipment damage and enemy jamming efforts. Most frustrating for Ripcord defenders, friendly forces were close enough to provide support, but separated by terrain that made physical reinforcement impossible. The base existed in tactical isolation despite being surrounded by American military presence. By July 3rd, water had become a critical concern. Normal consumption rates assumed regular resupply, but helicopter operations had delivered minimal fresh water since the siege began. Existing supplies were contaminated by debris from mortar attacks or lost when storage containers were punctured. Soldiers began rationing water to quantities insufficient for physical demands of mountain warfare in monsoon climate. Medical supplies presented another crisis. The base dispensary was designed to treat minor injuries and stabilize serious casualties for helicopter evacuation. Extended siege conditions meant treating gunshot wounds, shrapnel injuries, and disease with supplies intended for routine health care. Sergeant William Torres, a medic attached to Bravo Company, found himself performing surgical procedures beyond his training while working with equipment damaged by mortar fragments. Food supplies diminished rapidly as helicopter deliveries became sporadic. Sea rations provided adequate nutrition when consumed in full recommended quantities, but supply shortages forced rationing that left soldiers hungry and physically weakened. Combat effectiveness declined as energy levels dropped, and concentration became difficult to maintain. Morale suffered as physical discomfort combined with tactical uncertainty about the base's future. The psychological impact of prolonged siege was perhaps more damaging than physical deprivation. Soldiers trained for offensive operations found themselves confined to defensive positions under constant threat. Sleep became fragmented as enemy harassment continued throughout night hours. The knowledge that evacuation was impossible if seriously wounded created stress that affected decision-making and unit cohesion. July 5th marked the first major enemy ground assault against Ripcord's perimeter. North Vietnamese forces had used previous days to position assault troops in concealed locations around the base. The attack began with renewed mortar fire at 03:30 hours, followed by infantry movement against the northeastern sector of the perimeter. American forces detected the assault through trip flares and perimeter sensors, providing precious minutes to man defensive positions. Sergeant Dorsey's M60 position covered a key approach route up the hillside. Through his night vision scope, he could see enemy soldiers moving in small groups between terrain features that provided concealment from defensive fire. Range cards prepared during daylight helped him determine accurate firing data, but muzzle flashes would reveal his position to enemy observers once firing began. The decision of when to open fire represented the fundamental tactical dilemma of defensive warfare. Engage too early, and enemy forces would have time to seek cover and coordinate their assault. Wait too long, and attacking forces might close to ranges where small arms fire became ineffective. Experience and instinct guided these decisions more than doctrine or training. Dorsey opened fire when the lead enemy elements crossed a terrain feature that marked his final protective line. The M60's distinctive cyclic rate, approximately 550 rounds per minute, sent tracers arcing across the hillside in patterns that intersected advancing enemy positions. His assistant gunner, Private First Class James Murphy, fed ammunition belts and called out target corrections while scanning for additional threats. The machine gun's effectiveness derived not just from its rate of fire but from psychological impact on attacking forces. The sound of sustained automatic fire forced enemy soldiers to seek cover, disrupting coordinated movement and reducing their ability to support each other. Tracer rounds created visual reference points that helped other defenders identify target areas and coordinate their own fire. But sustained firing also created problems. The M60's barrel heated rapidly during extended engagement, potentially causing accuracy problems or catastrophic failure if not managed properly. Ammunition consumption was enormous. A single minute of continuous firing could exhaust an entire belt of 100 rounds. Most critically, muzzle flashes revealed the gun position to enemy observers, who could coordinate return fire or mortar strikes. The battle for Ripcord's northeastern perimeter lasted 4 hours. North Vietnamese forces demonstrated tactical sophistication that surpassed American expectations. Rather than launching frontal assault, enemy units used coordinated small group movements to probe defensive positions, while maintaining ability to withdraw if encountered effective resistance. Casualties were minimized by avoiding predictable attack patterns. American defensive fire was effective but costly. Ammunition expenditure far exceeded planned consumption rates for defensive scenarios. Several M60 positions experienced weapon malfunctions due to sustained firing and environmental conditions. Most concerning, radio communications revealed similar enemy pressure against other American installations throughout the A Shau Valley, suggesting coordination at levels beyond local tactical command. Dawn revealed evidence of determined enemy reconnaissance. Blood trails indicated casualties among attacking forces, but bodies had been removed during withdrawal. Equipment fragments suggested well-supplied enemy units with modern weapons. Most ominously, American soldiers found evidence of detailed preparation, range cards, sketched defensive positions, and pre-positioned demolition charges that indicated long-term observation and planning. The failed assault marked a tactical victory for American forces but strategic warning of larger enemy intentions. Intelligence assessment concluded that North Vietnamese forces were testing American defensive capabilities while gathering information for future operations. The siege of Ripcord was not opportunistic harassment, but systematic preparation for larger confrontation. July 8 brought renewed attempts to establish reliable helicopter resupply. Air Force planners developed new approach routes that utilized terrain masking to reduce exposure to enemy fire. UH-1 crews modified their aircraft with additional armor plating around crew compartments and fuel systems. Door gunners received upgraded ammunition loads with higher concentrations of armor-piercing rounds. The improvements proved partially successful. 2 helicopters managed to deliver ammunition and medical supplies before taking damage that forced emergency departure. 1 CH-47 Chinook successfully lifted out accumulated casualties, though the aircraft sustained multiple hits during the evacuation. Most importantly, radio equipment repairs restored reliable communications with higher headquarters and supporting units. Communication improvements revealed the broader tactical picture surrounding Ripcord. Similar enemy activities were intensifying throughout the region. Fire Support Base O'Reilly, located 15 kilometers southeast, reported increasing mortar attacks and ground reconnaissance. FSB Barnett, positioned to the north, had lost 2 helicopters to anti-aircraft fire. The pattern suggested coordinated enemy operations against multiple American positions. Strategic intelligence assessments concluded that North Vietnamese forces were implementing comprehensive campaign to neutralize American fire support bases throughout the A Shau Valley. Rather than accepting American control of key terrain, enemy forces had developed capability to challenge isolated positions through sustained siege operations. This tactical evolution threatened fundamental assumptions about terrain control and base security. Regional commanders faced difficult decisions about resource allocation and mission priorities. Reinforcing Ripcord would require diverting helicopters and artillery support from other threatened positions. Evacuating the base would abandon hard-won terrain and potentially encourage additional enemy operations. Most troubling, the enemy had demonstrated ability to sustain operations that American intelligence had considered impossible. The decision was made to reinforce Ripcord while developing contingency plans for evacuation if defensive positions became untenable. Additional artillery batteries were repositioned to provide more effective fire support. Air Force assets were allocated to provide close air support during critical helicopter operations. Most significantly, fresh infantry companies were designated for potential deployment if ground reinforcement became possible. July 12th brought weather conditions that temporarily favored American operations. Clear skies and reduced humidity allowed maximum helicopter sorties and effective air support during resupply missions. Multiple UH-1 flights managed to deliver significant quantities of ammunition, water, and food. Medical evacuation removed wounded soldiers who had been awaiting transport since the siege began. The successful resupply operations provided psychological boost as well as material relief. Soldiers who had been rationing water and ammunition could return to normal consumption. Hot meals replaced subsistence rations for the first time in over a week. Mail delivery restored communication with families back home. These improvements directly affected morale and combat effectiveness. But the respite also revealed accumulated damage from prolonged siege conditions. Equipment maintenance had fallen behind as soldiers focused on immediate survival. Weapons showed wear from constant use and inadequate cleaning. Electronic systems suffered from moisture damage and power irregularities. The base's infrastructure required significant repair before approaching original defensive capability. Medical examination of soldiers revealed physical deterioration beyond obvious combat injuries. Dehydration, malnutrition, and sleep deprivation had reduced combat effectiveness throughout the garrison. Foot problems from constantly wet conditions were nearly universal. Stress-related symptoms appeared in soldiers who had previously shown no psychological difficulties. July 15th brought coordinated enemy escalation that ended the brief improvement period. Mortar attacks resumed with increased intensity and accuracy. Sniper fire from improved positions made daylight movement extremely hazardous. Most ominously, helicopter approaches encountered coordinated anti-aircraft fire from multiple positions, suggesting enemy forces had received reinforcement and improved weapon systems. The renewed siege demonstrated North Vietnamese learning from previous American tactical responses. Enemy mortar positions were relocated frequently to avoid counter-battery fire. Anti-aircraft weapons were positioned to create overlapping coverage that could not be suppressed by single artillery missions. Infantry positions were improved to provide better protection while maintaining observation of American defensive positions. Sergeant Dorsey's machine gun section found itself under increasingly accurate enemy fire. His position had been identified during previous engagements, and enemy observers were directing precise mortar fire against his fighting hole. Moving to alternate positions became necessary, but each relocation required detailed preparation and risked exposure to sniper fire during movement. The tactical situation was deteriorating, despite individual acts of courage and competence. American technology and training provided advantages in direct confrontation, but enemy forces avoided decisive engagement, while gradually degrading American capability through attrition. Each day brought casualties that could not be replaced, equipment damage that could not be fully repaired, and supply shortages that could not be reliably addressed. How do American forces respond when their technological advantages are neutralized by patient, adaptive enemies who understand that time favors the defender of distant positions? July 18th provided the answer through desperate innovation and extraordinary individual courage. Captain William Estes, commanding a UH-1 crew tasked with emergency resupply, approached Ripcord through weather conditions that should have prevented flight operations. Low clouds, intermittent rain, and gusty winds reduced visibility to dangerous levels while making aircraft control difficult. The helicopter approached through a valley that provided terrain masking from known anti-aircraft positions, but required precise navigation to avoid controlled flight into mountains. Door Gunner Sergeant Robert Chen prepared his M60 for immediate engagement, while Crew Chief Specialist David Kim verified cargo security for rapid unloading. Every crew member understood that landing zone exposure time had to be minimized to survive enemy engagement. Estes brought his aircraft into hover over Ripcord's main landing zone, while enemy fire erupted from multiple directions. Small arms fire struck the helicopter's fuselage and rotor system, while mortar rounds bracketed the landing zone with increasing accuracy. Rather than departing immediately, Estes maintained hover for 12 minutes, while his crew literally threw supplies from the cargo compartment to desperate soldiers below. The decision to remain in position represented calculated risk that bordered on suicidal. Each second in hover increased probability of catastrophic hit, while providing minimal improvement in supply delivery. Standard procedure called for immediate departure once effective fire was received. Estes chose to continue the mission because he understood that Ripcord's defenders needed those supplies to survive. Door Gunner Chen provided suppressive fire against enemy positions throughout the extended hover, his M60 engaging targets that generated muzzle flashes or movement. His accurate fire prevented enemy forces from concentrating effective fire against the helicopter while allowing continued supply delivery. The psychological impact of aggressive return fire often proved as important as physical casualties inflicted. The helicopter finally departed with multiple systems damaged and fuel running low. Flight controls were compromised, making the journey back to base hazardous even without enemy fire. Navigation equipment was intermittent due to electrical damage. Most critically, power plant performance was degraded to levels that made single-engine flight marginal at best. Estes managed a successful emergency landing at the forward refueling point, though his aircraft was damaged beyond field repair capability. The mission delivered approximately 2,000 rounds of machine gun ammunition, medical supplies for treating 15 casualties, and water sufficient for 3 days at reduced consumption rates. More importantly, it demonstrated that helicopter resupply remained possible despite increasingly effective enemy countermeasures. The success of this mission encouraged additional attempts during the following days, but each flight faced escalating enemy resistance. Anti-aircraft fire became more accurate as enemy gunners learned to predict helicopter flight paths. Mortar fire against landing zones was increasingly well coordinated with aircraft approach times. Most ominously, Enemy forces began using rocket-propelled grenades against hovering helicopters, weapons that had not previously appeared in significant numbers. July 21st marked another tactical evolution when North Vietnamese forces began using captured American equipment against Ripcord's defenders. Claymore anti-personnel mines, presumably recovered from overrun positions elsewhere, were employed against American patrols attempting to clear enemy observation posts. M79 grenade launchers provided enemy forces with indirect fire capability at ranges where American small arms were less effective. The psychological impact of receiving fire from familiar American weapons was profound. Soldiers who had trained extensively with these systems understood their capabilities and limitations intimately. Hearing the distinctive sound of friendly weapons in enemy hands created stress beyond normal combat conditions. It also suggested that enemy forces had access to American ammunition supplies for these weapons. Tactical responses required immediate adaptation to unexpected threats. Patrol techniques developed for engaging enemy forces armed with AK-47 rifles proved less effective against opponents using M16 rifles with superior accuracy and range. Movement formations that provided protection against mortar fire were vulnerable to claymore mines positioned at choke points along likely approach routes. Most concerning was the implication for equipment security throughout American positions in Vietnam. If enemy forces could acquire significant quantities of American weapons and ammunition, operational security was compromised at fundamental levels. Intelligence assessments needed revision to account for enemy capabilities that matched, rather than simply opposed, American technological advantages. July 23rd brought the final major ground assault against Ripcord's defensive perimeter. North Vietnamese forces had used 3 weeks of siege operations to identify weak points in American dispositions, while positioning assault forces for coordinated attack. The final battle would test every tactical lesson learned by both sides during the prolonged confrontation. The assault began at 02:45 hours with unprecedented mortar concentration against defensive positions that had been carefully identified during previous weeks. Rather than general area fire, enemy mortars engaged specific machine gun positions, command bunkers, and communications facilities with accuracy that demonstrated detailed intelligence preparation. American counter-battery fire proved ineffective against mortars that were repositioned immediately after firing. Enemy infantry approached through multiple routes simultaneously, preventing American forces from concentrating defensive fires against single axis of attack. Sapper teams used demolition charges to breach defensive wire, while assault troops followed closely behind. The coordination demonstrated tactical sophistication equal to American military doctrine and superior to previous North Vietnamese ground operations. Sergeant Dorsey's position received concentrated attention from enemy assault forces. His machine gun had inflicted significant casualties during previous engagements, making its suppression a priority for attacking forces. Enemy soldiers approached his position through dead space that provided concealment until the final 50 meters of movement. When they finally became visible, range was too close for indirect fire support without endangering defending troops. The final engagement was decided by individual marksmanship and mechanical reliability rather than sophisticated tactics or advanced technology. Dorsey's M60 functioned flawlessly despite weeks of hard use in adverse conditions. His assistant gunner maintained steady ammunition supply while calling corrections based on tracer observation. Both soldiers demonstrated proficiency that justified their extensive training and experience. Enemy assault forces demonstrated equal professionalism and determination. Rather than retreating when initial assaults stalled, they regrouped and attempted alternative approaches. Individual enemy soldiers continued advancing despite casualties among their units. The attack was pressed with determination that spoke of extensive preparation and strong motivation among attacking forces. The battle continued for 5 hours before enemy forces began systematic withdrawal. American defensive positions had held, but ammunition consumption was enormous, and several weapon systems had suffered mechanical failure. Casualties among defenders were significant, though enemy losses appeared equally heavy, based on blood trails and equipment left behind during withdrawal. Dawn revealed the tactical situation with brutal clarity. Ripcord's defensive positions had survived direct assault, but supply situation was desperate. Ammunition reserves were insufficient for sustained defense against similar attacks. Medical supplies were exhausted, and several wounded soldiers required immediate evacuation. Most critically, helicopter operations remained impossible due to effective enemy anti-aircraft coverage. Intelligence assessment concluded that enemy forces retained capability for additional major attacks, despite casualties sustained during the failed assault. Intercepted radio communications suggested reinforcement was arriving to replace losses and potentially increase pressure against the base. Weather forecasts predicted continued conditions that would favor enemy operations over American air mobility. Regional commanders faced the fundamental question that had defined American strategy throughout Vietnam. When does tactical success become strategically meaningless? Ripcord's defenders had demonstrated courage, skill, and determination that honored military tradition. But their isolated position had become a liability that consumed resources without contributing to larger strategic objectives. July 23rd, evening. The order came through encrypted radio transmission from division headquarters. Prepare for evacuation. Operation Republic Peak would extract all personnel and equipment from Fire Support Base Ripcord within 72 hours. The base that had been defended at such cost would be abandoned to enemy forces. The evacuation order represented military pragmatism, overriding tactical pride. Ripcord had served its purpose by disrupting enemy operations and demonstrating American willingness to contest remote terrain. Continued defense would consume resources needed for operations that offered greater strategic potential. The decision was tactically sound, but emotionally devastating for soldiers who had endured weeks of siege. Evacuation planning required sophisticated coordination between multiple aircraft types, artillery support, and ground security forces. CH-47 Chinook helicopters would lift out artillery pieces and heavy equipment. UH-1 Hueys would evacuate personnel and sensitive materials. Air Force fighters would provide close air support during the withdrawal. Every phase would occur under enemy observation and potential fire. Soldiers began destroying equipment that could not be evacuated and would provide intelligence value to enemy forces. Ammunition that could not be transported was detonated in controlled explosions. Electronic equipment was disabled beyond repair. Documents were burned, and radio codes were changed to prevent enemy exploitation of captured materials. The psychological preparation for evacuation proved more difficult than physical preparations. Soldiers who had defended every meter of ground were ordered to abandon positions they had held at significant personal cost. The logic was militarily sound, but emotionally difficult for men who measured success by terrain retained and enemy casualties inflicted. July 24th brought the final helicopter operations at Fire Support Base Ripcord. Enemy forces had observed evacuation preparations and positioned anti-aircraft weapons to interdict withdrawal operations. Each helicopter approaching the base faced coordinated fire from multiple directions. Pilots required extraordinary skill and courage to complete their missions under such conditions. The first evacuation flights successfully removed wounded personnel and sensitive equipment while enemy fire damaged several aircraft but caused no immediate casualties. Pilot competence and crew coordination enabled mission completion despite hostile conditions that challenged both individual skills and aircraft performance capabilities. Subsequent flights faced increasingly severe enemy resistance as anti-aircraft fire became more accurate and concentrated. Enemy forces were learning from each helicopter operation, improving their targeting and coordination. Flight routes that provided safety during initial missions became hazardous as enemy gunners adjusted their positions and firing techniques. Chief Warrant Officer Martinez, whose helicopter had been damaged during early siege operations, volunteered to pilot one of the final evacuation flights. His intimate knowledge of Ripcord's landing zones and local terrain features made him valuable, despite regulations that normally would have prevented flight duties after aircraft crash. Personal bonds with soldiers he would evacuate provided additional motivation beyond professional duty. The final evacuation flight departed Ripcord at 15:47 hours on July 24, 1970. Sergeant Dorsey was among the last soldiers to board, having remained at his machine gun position until enemy fire made continued defense pointless. As his helicopter lifted off, he looked down at positions he had defended for 23 days, watching smoke rise from demolished bunkers and abandoned equipment. The evacuation of Fire Support Base Ripcord concluded one of the longest sustained siege operations conducted against American forces during the Vietnam War. Total casualties included 61 Americans killed, 341 wounded, and 5 missing in action. 8 helicopters were destroyed, and numerous others sustained battle damage. Equipment losses included artillery pieces, vehicles, communication systems, and personal equipment, valued at several $million. Enemy casualties remained unknown, as North Vietnamese forces consistently removed their dead and wounded from battlefields. Intelligence estimates suggested significant losses during assault operations, but total numbers could not be verified through captured documents or prisoner interrogation. The tactical exchange rate favored American forces, but strategic implications were more complex. The siege of Ripcord demonstrated both American tactical competence and strategic limitations in Vietnam counterinsurgency operations. Individual soldiers and small units performed with courage and skill that upheld military traditions. Equipment functioned reliably under extreme conditions. Helicopter operations continued despite increasing enemy countermeasures. Artillery support provided effective fire despite challenging terrain and weather conditions. But tactical success at the unit level could not resolve strategic problems inherent in American military involvement in Southeast Asia. Fire support bases like Ripcord consumed enormous resources without generating decisive results against enemy forces that could choose when and where to engage. Terrain control remained temporary, as long as enemy forces retained capability to contest American positions through patient siege operations. The evacuation also revealed enemy tactical evolution throughout the Vietnam conflict. North Vietnamese forces had developed sophisticated capabilities for sustained operations against isolated American positions. Their coordination between indirect fire, anti-aircraft weapons, and ground assault demonstrated military competence equal to American forces in many tactical situations. Most significantly, they had learned to exploit American dependence on helicopter mobility. Decades after the evacuation, veterans of fire support base Ripcord continued to grapple with questions about military effectiveness and strategic purpose in Vietnam. Their individual performance had been exemplary by any professional standard. Their collective sacrifice honored traditions of American military service, but the strategic context that had placed them in an untenable position remained troubling. The monsoon rains that had complicated military operations during the siege eventually washed away physical traces of American presence at Ripcord. Jungle growth reclaimed defensive positions carved from red clay soil. Local populations returned to agricultural patterns that predated military construction. Nature demonstrated the temporary character of human conflict while bearing witness to its intensity. Contemporary military analysis of the Ripcord siege emphasized lessons about force protection, logistics security, and the limitations of static defensive positions in counterinsurgency operations. Subsequent American military doctrine incorporated these lessons into training programs and operational planning procedures. The institutional learning prevented repetition of tactical mistakes, while honoring the sacrifice of soldiers who had paid for that education. Individual veterans processed their Ripcord experiences through different psychological frameworks. Some emphasized pride in professional competence under extreme conditions. Others focused on bonds with fellow soldiers that transcended normal friendship. Many struggled with survivor guilt and questions about the larger purpose that had justified their sacrifice and loss of comrades. The annual reunions that began in the 1980s provided forums for veterans to share memories and process experiences that civilian society could not fully understand. These gatherings became sacred rituals, where survivors honored fallen comrades while celebrating their own continued existence. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and bonds were renewed among men who had shared extraordinary circumstances. Sergeant Dorsey, who survived the siege and completed his tour in Vietnam, returned to civilian life in Tennessee, where he worked construction and raised a family. The mechanical skills that had served him as a machine gunner transferred to civilian employment. But the psychological skills required for processing combat experiences took decades to develop. His M60 machine gun resided in a place of honor in his garage, a tangible reminder of service that few could understand. The helicopter pilots who had sustained Ripcord through impossible conditions went on to military careers that benefited from their Vietnam experience. The tactical skills developed under hostile conditions prepared them for leadership roles in subsequent military operations. Many continued flying until mandatory retirement, driven by passion for aviation that had been tested and confirmed under ultimate pressure. The medics who had treated wounded soldiers with inadequate supplies and improvised procedures carried their experience into civilian medical careers where they appreciated resources that seemed abundant compared to battlefield conditions. Their understanding of trauma treatment under pressure influenced emergency medical protocols that saved lives in civilian hospitals throughout America. Fire Support Base. Ripcord was never reoccupied by American forces. The terrain that had seemed strategically important in 1970 was abandoned to enemy control as American military involvement in Vietnam declined. Strategic priorities shifted to other objectives, while the Red Clay Summit returned to jungle conditions that preceded military construction. The North Vietnamese army that had besieged Ripcord continued operations throughout the American withdrawal from Southeast Asia. Their tactical lessons from the siege were incorporated into doctrine used against South Vietnamese forces during the final campaigns that ended with the fall of Saigon in 1975. The patience and determination they had demonstrated at Ripcord served them well in the larger strategic campaign. Today, the summit where Fire Support Base Ripcord once dominated the A Shau Valley is covered by tropical vegetation that conceals traces of American military presence. Local farmers cultivate rice paddies in valleys that once echoed with helicopter rotors and artillery fire. Children play in areas where soldiers once fought for survival against patient, determined enemies. The strategic lessons of Ripcord extend beyond Vietnam to contemporary military operations in environments where technological superiority cannot guarantee tactical success against determined opposition. The siege demonstrated that individual courage and professional competence, while admirable and necessary, cannot overcome strategic situations that place military forces in untenable positions. The human cost of those 23 days remains the most significant legacy of Fire Support Base Ripcord. 61 American families received notification that their sons, husbands, and fathers had been killed defending a remote hilltop in a distant country. Hundreds more families welcomed home wounded soldiers whose lives were forever changed by their experience on that Red Clay Summit. But alongside tragedy, the siege of Ripcord produced examples of courage, sacrifice, and professional competence that honored American military traditions while revealing the limitations of military solutions to political problems. The soldiers who defended that isolated position demonstrated qualities that justify respect and remembrance, even as strategic questions about their deployment remain valid subjects for historical analysis. The monsoon mists that once concealed North Vietnamese assault forces continue to rise from the valleys around what was once Fire Support Base Ripcord. Morning fog still clings to ridgelines where American soldiers maintained vigilant watch against patient enemies. The natural cycles that preceded human conflict have resumed their ancient patterns, indifferent to the intensity of combat that once disrupted their rhythm. In the end, the siege of Fire Support Base Ripcord stands as testimony to the courage of individual soldiers who served with honor in circumstances beyond their control or understanding. Their sacrifice earned the right to be remembered with respect and gratitude, even as their strategic situation demonstrates the tragic consequences of political decisions that place military forces in impossible positions. Remember them. Remember their courage under impossible pressure. Remember their sacrifice for causes larger than themselves. Remember that freedom carries costs measured not in dollars, but in lives, dreams, and families, forever changed by service to country. What price are we willing to pay to preserve the freedoms they defended? How do we honor their sacrifice while learning from strategic mistakes that placed them in harm's way? These questions remain relevant as long as American military forces serve in distant places where individual courage confronts strategic complexity. Subscribe to honor their memory. Share these stories to ensure their sacrifice is not forgotten. Like this video to support content that preserves the legacy of American soldiers who served with distinction in humanity's most challenging circumstances. Their courage deserves our remembrance. Their sacrifice demands our respect. Their legacy requires our continued vigilance in preserving the freedoms they defended with their lives.